This is my update for Russian military operations in Ukraine for September 9th, 2022. In addition to Ukraine's offensive launched in the Kherson region, there has also now been an offensive launched outside of Kharkov city in the eastern and southeastern direction toward Izium, around Izium. Let's take a look at liveuamap.com. This is a very pro-Ukrainian map. A lot of the information visualized here comes from the Ukrainian General Staff and other official Ukrainian sources. And if we look around Kherson, this pro-Ukrainian map is not showing any progress at all. That offensive is over, and it came at great cost, the meager gains that were made. And I'll get into that in just a moment. Now let's look around Kharkov. They're claiming that troops got as far as Kupiansk. And we see these rifle icons, these blue rifle icons indicating Ukrainian forces fighting in those areas. And there's also a blue flag icon. They're claiming that Ukrainian troops are taking at least some territory in Balaklia. Now, what does this actually look like, though, to you? This looks like a frontal assault. They drove deep into Russian-held territory, and now they are surrounded on multiple sides by Russian forces. This is exactly what Russia did at the beginning of this conflict, this special military operation in late February. They rushed into Ukraine in multiple areas, and they found themselves surrounded by Ukrainian troops. Now, in places like Kherson, Ukrainian forces retreated or surrendered. Russia was able to begin the encirclement of Mariupol using this tactic. They were able to shape the battlefield in the Donbas region using this tactic. In other places where Ukrainian forces stood and fought, say around Kyiv, this did not work, and it became a holding operation, tying up Ukrainian forces there while Russian forces consolidated control where it was sustainable to do so elsewhere. And that is what eventually defined the line of contact from then until now. And then it has been a process of Russia incrementally advancing and changing those lines little by little, because in modern warfare, when both sides have capable air defenses, have modern weapons, have large armies on the battlefield, you cannot just rush on the battlefield across defended territory. You will have huge losses, and you will not be able to sustain that. So why is Ukraine doing this at this juncture? They are doing it to have something very temporary to show on the battlefield after months of retreating and failing across the entire country. That is what this is about. It is purely political, is not sustainable, and I'm going to get into this in detail. So we have articles like this from CNBC, and I think the headline tells you everything you need to know. Ukraine seizes the moment with surprise counterattacks. U.S. approves further $675 million in weapons for Kyiv. And then U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken popped up in Kyiv and announced another $3 billion being spent on Ukraine and its allies. What does the CNBC article say? It says Ukraine confirmed it had launched a counterattack in the Kharkiv region in the northeast of the country, with President Volodymyr Zelensky stating in his nightly address Wednesday that this week we have good news from Kharkiv region. Zelensky said several settlements have been recaptured, but added that now is not the time to name the towns where the Ukrainian flag is returning in a bid to maintain a strategic advantage. Nonsense. Russia is obviously going to know where they are losing territory, where they are gaining territory. They're not announcing the name of these villages because where they are raising these flags will be very temporary. What they have done is put a large number of troops into a position where they could be potentially surrounded, cut off, and eliminated. This was a self-imposed cauldron of sorts. At best, they're going to have to retreat. The lines will stabilize and they will be back to where they started, just like around Kherson. Russian forces are being resupplied from right over the border. Russian military aviation, they are flying from airfields right on the other side of the border, running sorties at these Ukrainian forces pushing into Russian-held territory. This is extremely unsustainable. This is not going to turn out well for Ukraine. What else did the CNBC article write about? What was in that $675 million weapons package? Well, it says more guided multiple launch rocket systems. These are the rockets fired by the HIMARS multiple launch rocket system. Howitzers, they don't say what caliber. Ammunition, Humvees, armored ambulances, anti-tank systems, among other equipment. This is going to be provided to Ukraine in quantities that aren't even going to allow Ukraine to continue sustaining the level of fighting they're engaged in. And it most certainly is not going to cover the massive, massive losses that they have just suffered around Kherson and are now suffering around Kharkov. And I want to point out how even the Western media is reporting this. This is the Washington Post. Wounded Ukrainian soldiers reveal steep toll of Kherson offensive. And you and I just looked at the map. What did that offensive result in? Did you see any significant change on the map? But here's the price that they paid for these headlines that they were on the offensive. Something to show after months and billions of dollars of Western aid. We lost 5 people for every one they did, said Ihor, a 30-year-old platoon commander who injured his back when the tank he was riding in crashed into a ditch. The article goes on and says, Russian Orlan drones exposed Ukrainian positions from more than a kilometer above their heads, they said, an altitude that meant they never heard the buzz of the aircraft tracking their movements. It goes on and says, Russian tanks emerged from newly built cement fortifications to blast infantry with large caliber artillery, the wounded Ukrainian soldiers said. The vehicles would then shrink back beneath the concrete shelters, shielded from mortar and rocket fire. Counter-battery radar systems automatically detected and located Ukrainians who are targeting the Russians with projectiles, unleashing a barrage of artillery fire in response. Russian hacking tools hijacked the drones of Ukrainian operators who saw their aircraft drift away helplessly behind enemy lines. Ukraine has discouraged coverage of the offensive, resulting in an information lag on a potentially pivotal inflection point in the nearly 7-month conflict. Well, you just heard the Washington Post explain what took place. That is not an inflection point. Or if by inflection point they mean from this seemingly stalemate situation into just the complete collapse of Ukrainian forces, then maybe that is an inflection point. But I think we can all agree on why Ukraine didn't want anyone covering this, because it was an abysmal failure. Ukraine, with this media blackout, both around Kherson and now around Kharkov, this isn't to trick Russia. Russia knows what's going on the battlefield. This is to trick the public. That's all this is. The Washington Post also says Ukrainian soldiers said they had to carefully ration their use of munitions. But even when they did fire, they had trouble hitting targets. When you give the coordinates, it's supposed to be accurate, but it's not, he said, noting that his equipment dated back to 1989. It also said Ukrainian claims of retaking villages such as Vysokopilia could not be confirmed. Those soldiers interviewed said they were able to advance into some previously Russian-controlled villages. Those soldiers declined to name the villages, citing instructions from their superiors. A group of Washington Post journalists who traveled within 3 miles of the village in northern Kherson on Monday were prevented from entering the village by Ukrainian troops and could not ascertain its status. A local official said Ukrainian and Russian forces were still battling for control. And let's just say that they did take these villages. If you look at a map, they are at the very fringe of Russian-held territory. So they paid this tremendous price for a handful of villages at the very fringe of Russian-held territory. And I'm talking about entire brigades, thousands of men dying or crippled in the fighting for this very limited PR stunt that even the Washington Post can't really find much to do with. And you see articles like this. This is just what they're admitting to. And now there's no reason to believe that the offensive around Kharkov is going to go any differently. Now we're talking about Ukrainian forces being fed right into Russia's main force. Russia's main force is in the Donbas region. It is not around Kherson. Their supply lines are coming right over the border from Russia. Their warplanes are taking off from airfields right on the other side of the border. So how do you think an offensive in that in that kind of environment is going to go. But anyway, let's take a look at this article. This is The Guardian. We have already lost far-right Russian bloggers, slam military failures. So this is pro-Russian bloggers panicking. Quite frankly, they're panicking. This is precisely what the offensive was meant to do. It's a PR stunt. It also has a dimension of psychological warfare attached to it. So this is what The Guardian says. After Ukraine's latest counteroffensive in the south and the northeast of the country, these bloggers, who have so far been granted a public platform denied to many, have intensified their criticism of the Kremlin, slamming the army's inadequate performance in the war and urging Vladimir Putin to declare a full-scale mobilization. Well, I've seen this type of panic before. When Ukraine launches any offensive, such as the one outside of Kharkov months ago, there was a similar panic. There were people asking questions, how could this be allowed? How come Russia isn't better prepared? And they're not looking at the big picture. They're not looking at where Russia is actually pushing, where they are holding, and where they are fixing Ukrainian forces. They're also not taking lessons from extremely recent history, where Russia will give up ground to advancing Ukrainian forces so that they expend their fighting capacity, stall, and then they wrap their forces around what's left of these Ukrainian forces. And they either encircle and destroy them, or they drive them out at great cost to Ukraine, at a much lesser cost to Russian forces. This is the whole point. This is how Russia has been fighting this from the very beginning. I often talk about military matters requiring a certain degree of patience. It's going to require patience to wait for Ukraine to push as far as it can with this offensive, stall, and then wait for Russia to react. How are they going to mobilize their forces around this incursion and either encircle it or drive it out? Now, I said that this was a public relations stunt. For what? For what reason? And I think the CNBC article kind of gives us a little insight. And I think also this one from NPR does as well. It's titled, U.S. provides nearly $3 billion to Ukraine as Blinken makes unannounced visit to Kyiv. Now, how do you think between almost $700 million and now another $3 billion, all at the same time, how do you think they would be able to justify that if Ukraine didn't have something to show for, even if it's just this very temporary offensive launched around Kherson, already failed, and now outside of Kharkov? Let's listen to this NPR article. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made an unannounced trip to Kyiv on Thursday, where he announced almost $3 billion worth of financial aid and weapons to help Ukraine during the Russian invasion. Ukraine's extraordinary frontline defenders continue to courageously fight for their country's freedom, Blinken said in a statement Thursday afternoon, announcing the new tranche of funding. And President Biden has been clear, we will support the people of Ukraine for as long as it takes. He said the administration will make $2.2 billion available for long-term investments to bolster the security of Ukraine and 18 of its neighbors, many of which are NATO allies that face the risk of potential future Russian aggression. And think about the way he worded this. This was worded to coincide with these offensives. You don't just throw a $3 billion package together. This was all planned together. They know that even if this offensive completely fails, and in a week's time, Ukraine is in a weaker position than when this all started, it doesn't matter because they pushed through all of this money. Then they have time to reformulate the next trick that they'll use to justify hundreds of millions, if not billions, more. And because the people putting these packages together are not paying for them, Western taxpayers are, and so are Ukrainians on the front line with their blood, they could continue doing this process over and over for as long as possible, for as long as profitable. Nothing, absolutely nothing has changed in Ukraine between the time before they launched these offensives, when they were incrementally losing across the entire front line, to now. Nothing has changed. All that they've done is draw forces a little here, a little there, concentrate them outside of Kherson, outside of Izium, and launch these offensives. They are going to burn through these men and equipment. They will exhaust these two offensives. They will get their headlines. They already are. They'll get their PR win. And then it'll go back to positional fighting and them incrementally being pushed off the battlefield. That is where this is all headed. You just need to be patient and wait for the process to work itself out. These bloggers that The Guardian is talking about, they panic over everything. If you look into the background of some of them have serious credentials, but they've been out of the loop for a while. Some of them have a grudge against Moscow. And so The Guardian is being very opportunistic, taking the comments and commentary from these malcontents and trying to shape it into some psychological collapse on the Russian side, when I think what we're actually watching from Russia is very patient professionalism, allowing this offensive to play out, preserving as much life and equipment as possible so that they can go on to the counterattack on their terms and make Ukraine pay for this. And they will. And we just have to be patient and wait for that to unfold. So that does it for this update. I'll keep an eye on it. If there are any more major developments, I will do another update. Until then, please, if you thought this was useful, like and share. Check the video description, especially if you're watching this on YouTube, for other places to find and follow my work. I am on Telegram. I'm also on Odyssey and Rumble, where all of my YouTube videos are automatically backed up on. And if for some reason I am taken off of YouTube, I will continue uploading videos on Rumble and Odyssey. In the video description below, you will find all of the links that I just referenced, as well as for ways you can help support my work. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and also PayPal. To everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. That is what makes this possible. I could not do this work without that support. So again, thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.